row. I've got to take a picture. This is amazing.
Yotam and I were chatting backstage before, and this is actually the biggest audience that he's ever performed in front of.
Yeah,
More than double
true.
the size.
Oh.
Firstly, Yotam, thank you so much for being here with all of us tonight, and welcome to Sydney. I can't believe you're still upright. Yotam showed me his calendar on his phone earlier, and his page after page of 15-minute intervals of which he's doing various things all around the country. And I just wanted to start off by reading you a text that I got from my good friend Annabelle Crabb today, who interviewed you twice last night.
Yeah, 5:30 and 7:30.
Are you doing Yotam tonight? He is absolutely charm itself. Effing hell, I love him. So a bit of feedback from how things went yesterday. But I actually just wanted to start by talking to you about your food. As Edwina mentioned, Ottolenghi is a thing that kind of, it's your name obviously, it's the name of your deli, but it's also, I guess, a style of cooking now. You can, if my wife calls me up and says, what are we having for dinner tonight? And I say, Ottolenghi, she knows she's kind of probably in for a cauliflower. But the way that we see your food and the way that the public sees your food, the things that we pick up on, is sometimes quite different from, I guess, your intention, or maybe the way that you see your own food. So could you maybe try and describe to me how you see your Ottolenghi cuisine?
Yeah, well, I find this quite overwhelming, what you're describing, because I understand, in theory, the whole business of Ottolenghi being something that people cook and understand, but I just go about my life. Like any other person, I try a recipe, I come home, I have dinner with my family, and I go to bed. But I think one of the things that dawned on me at one point is how much there is behind that word, Ottolenghi, which is completely separated from me now for quite a long time, because it's my family name, but actually it stands for so much for different people. When we made this dish in the test kitchen one day, a few years ago, and it was the most beautiful pea soup we've ever made. It was really, vibrant green and really kept its flavor, and it tasted of mint and peas, and it was beautifully prepared, and everybody tasted it. And I've got in the test kitchen, there's always 2 or 3 people tasting things together, and someone says, but it's not very Ottolenghi. And I thought to myself, wow, that is really an achievement, to say that, something that we've just prepared as a group. I don't know exactly who made it at that point, and we can just say that just not belong to us. And I could understand it, because in a sense it was missing an edge. It didn't have a twist. It didn't have a surprise. It was wonderfully predictable, but it wasn't Ottolenghi. So we quickly took some bread and rolled it out and put some goat cheese and rolled it together and sprinkled some red peppercorns, I think, and deep fried it and cut it into slices and put it on top, and it was sorted. And I think this kind of story just kind of exemplifies this idea that it needs to be familiar on one hand, but not familiar on the other. And I think this is what it has become with. Of course, there's vegetables and there's a set of ingredients, the Middle Eastern ingredients, but a lot of other chefs do that too. But I think it's the idea that you take something which seems like it makes sense, you ask yourself a minute, will it really work? And then I hope it mostly works. Yeah.
Is it similar to the type of food that you grew up eating, or is it a style that, I guess, has evolved in your professional life and also in maybe your collaborations with other people?
No, it's not the food that I grew up eating. So I grew up in Jerusalem in the 1970s and 80s, and there were 2 types of cuisines, or there was many cuisines, but the cuisines that I was exposed to were mainly, at home, was kind of quite European food. My parents, my dad was of Italian origin and my mom was German. And we had food that I would call it just European. I mean, my dad would make pastas and polentas, what's not to like. But, and my mom made, potatoes and cabbage and things you have in kind of Northern European food. But outside, as you kind of walked out the door, was mainly Palestinian food, the Arabic food, as people would mostly recognize it here as Lebanese food. And of course, it's not exactly the same, but this is the gist. But those are very different things from what I cook. And often people say, you cook Israeli food. But Israeli food actually is something that is still evolving. It's kind of reached a certain level of evolvement, if that's a word right now. But it wasn't like that when I was growing up. And I think what I do is take things that are slightly familiar. I would use tahini, that's in hummus, etc. But kind of modernize it a bit and add certain flourishes and add certain aspects that wouldn't have been there when I was growing up.
Yeah, I've heard a quote from you before, that said you want to create drama in the mouth. Is there something dramatic to the changes that you make to very simple dishes to bring it forward, to bring it to something new?
So it's my main my main love is vegetables. I mean, there's a lot of things in my books that are not vegetables, but vegetables would be my first port of call. You mentioned cauliflower as a good example, and that is, I love cauliflowers. And this book, Simple, that I'm here promoting, has got 3 or 4, I think, really good example of different things you can do with the cauliflower. And I think it's what draws me to vegetables so much is the versatility, is the fact that you could really do so many things. And I genuinely think that you can do much more with a cauliflower than you can do with a piece of meat, whatever meat you're going to do, because you can eat it raw, just like that, dipped in something, and you can slice it and deep fry it, and you get something really crisp. Or you can turn it into a fritter and get something which is a little bit crisp on the outside, but really kind of moist and wet and beautiful in the inside. And you can roast it, and you can steam it, and everything yields different results. And I've got this fascination with how far you can take vegetables, how far you can, what you could do with them. And you can go pretty far.
So let's talk about the vegetable thing for a moment, because, and I want to ask this question without sounding rude, because sometimes if you say that success is unexpected, it can mean that it's unworthy or something. And I don't mean that in any way, but you're a chef who's cooking, inverted commas, foreign food that's vegetable focused, that is based in the UK, that is now arguably done more for championing the cause of vegetables than, and I should mention that you're not a vegetarian yourself, than any of the vegetarians and vegans or PETA activists or doctors sitting people down and saying, eat more vegetables or you will die. And you've written a cookbook, and 6 cookbooks now, and opened a string of restaurants. Why has your food, been so influential in changing the way people cook? What Edwina mentioned before about going to a dinner party in Sydney and everyone's brought an Ottolenghi salad. That is 100% a thing that happens, and everyone here knows that exactly that is what happens. Why do you think that it was what's the secret? Why was it you? So
first of all, I just want to say thank you, because I never take it for granted that people would cook my food and in such numbers, and I'm literally shocked and surprised to see that this happens. And the sales figures, thank you. Thanks to everybody. But that is the one thing, and I don't really have a very good explanation. I've got a bits of understandings or insights that I can probably point to. One of them, I think, is the fact that the ingredients of the Middle East that I grew up with, the preserved lemons and the za'atar and the tahini and the pomegranate molasses and the rose syrup, they were all kind of around, but used in very traditional contexts. And when you look at Palestinian food or Lebanese food, in the traditional sense, it doesn't feel very modern, and it feels quite old, and often brown doesn't look very attractive for the Instagram generation. And I think what myself and Sami Tamimi, who is the co-author of a couple of my books, and also we work closely in our restaurants, we've kind of made it a bit more contemporary by focusing on bringing the vegetables out and their natural colors and working with garnishes and salsas and things. So create that contrast that I kind of explained a little bit about, the flourishes. That's what I think that's the kind of the power of the Ottolenghi effect. So it's not just a hummus. If it's a hummus, then it might have like a pickled chili salsa, and it will have something else. Just things to kind of bring out those flavors and colors. That is one way that I think about it. The other is really that what I try to do is I try to look at every vegetable, mostly vegetables, as I said, from every possible angle and kind of turn it on its head and look what there is to do about it. And yes, a lot of people do that, but I'm kind of obsessive about that, if you haven't realized yet. And I could take a kohlrabi. Kohlrabi is really challenging to cook with. It's quite watery, and spend like a couple of weeks figuring how you roast a kohlrabi and keep having the flavor, which is actually a dilemma that we had in the test kitchen just a couple of weeks ago, so it's fresh in my head. And because it's really great raw and it's crunchy, it's like a radish, but every time I try to cook it, it goes really bland. So we did this thing, and it worked, where when we roasted it for a good hour, an hour and a half, and then I cut like little slices halfway through it, like Hasselback style.
Oh, wow.
And then we made this paste with anchovies and herbs and just really stuck it inside and roasted it for a bit longer. And the result was really magical, but it took quite a lot of work but I just wanted to crack that kohlrabi, And so I'm quite persistent like that. And that is because I really think that there is so much to get from vegetables, and I focus on them. So that might be also part of the explanation.
Do you think about the food that you cook as being part of that sort of broader push to get people to eat more vegetables, or is it literally just, how do you make a kohlrabi tasty?
Yeah, I actually am. I really have an aversion to trying to push the people to do anything, and I don't like people telling me what to eat, and I don't like to tell people what to eat. Really, that's the one thing that I feel really strongly about. It's never been my agenda to get people to eat something or not, and I think one of the reasons why. Why we are developing a complicated relationship with food, many people do, I feel sometimes that I get confused, is because we are told all the time what we should or what we shouldn't be eating. So there's on the one hand, there's the things we have to eat, or whatever superfood it is at the moment. And on the other hand, there's these things that we shouldn't really touch, whatever sugar, fat, whatever it is at the moment. And this is really confusing because we can't rely on our instincts anymore. And so I don't want to be one of those people that say you have to eat vegetables all the time, because if someone hears that in the back of their minds that they have to eat certain vegetables or a certain amount of vegetable, and they feel like something else, then they start feeling guilty. And mixing food with guilt is like the worst combination, because food is just all about pleasure. And it's really easy to get into this cycle. So I just think vegetables are wonderful, and I put it out there, and people can choose whether to eat or not to eat and what they want to do with them. I'm happy.
Fantastic. So let's go back to the beginning a little bit. You're the son of a scientist and a teacher. You have a master's in comparative literature. You worked as a magazine editor. You also worked for Israeli military intelligence for a while. How do you end up then going to Le Cordon Bleu and thinking, I'm going to open a deli?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how to answer this. I mean, I've done certain things. I mean, every Israeli young man does the military service in general. So I did it, and I ended up doing a job in an office, which was not that exciting, but it was intelligence military, so that sounds good. Then I went to university, and like every other Jewish boy, got a degree because my parents thought I should get one. And then a bit like you. But then something happened, and I realized that I cannot and would not spend my life at university. And I've told this story today, but I'll tell it again because it's just really, it encapsulates what I've experienced. Is that when I finished my degree, my university degree, I wrote a dissertation. And I printed out in like 5-6 copies, and I handed it up to all the people that are close to me, my friends, my family, my supervisor at university. And to this day, I think nobody had read my dissertation. I mean, I assumed the supervisor read it because she gave me a mark, but nobody else read my dissertation. And that is really soul-destroying because I spent, put aside the fact that it's probably pretty boring, but I spent 2 years doing that. And you know, as a chef, how quickly you get these kind of incredible reactions when you make something good and people try it. And immediately you get this kind of immediate gratification. So the gap between those two reactions that you get to food and you get to a university paper that you write is so big, it's glaring that I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay. And that's how it happened.
Just as an aside, you're not the only member of your family that has experience working in military intelligence, are you?
This book tour is really weird. I've done so many book tours, and nobody ever talked about my grandmother. And I think Annabelle started it yesterday. She said to me, I heard your mom was a secret agent. Your grandmother was a secret agent. And I said, yeah, I think I mentioned it sometimes, but nobody ever talked about it. Yeah, that is true. My grandmother was distributing guns to agents, Israeli agents in Europe in the 1960s. That is true.
She was also a secret Mossad operative and part of the team that abducted Adolf Eichmann from Argentina and extradited him for trial. That's a nod right there.
My grandmother was quite special because, she, as you can imagine, she was a woman on a mission. So we had, every Saturday at 2 p.m., we had lunch in her house. And it was always the same lunch. And every time we used to sit down at 2, she was very particular about how things would be. And she always made a cauliflower, but it was nothing like my cauliflower. It was boiled like for a very long time. And she had the buttery bread sauce. Actually, I really do love that. You know, when you take a bit of breadcrumbs and you fry them in butter and put them on the cauliflower, it was quite nice. And then the main course often was ox tongue. So sliced ox tongue with a kind of a salsa verde, which is
I love ox
kind
tongue.
of nice. Yeah, I do like ox tongue, but that was kind of our Saturday lunch.
Let's go back to the dissertation, because I believe your dissertation was on the philosophy of the photographic image. Now, even though your friends and family at that time may not have read it, is that something that you use in the nuts and bolts of your career now? If you look at any one of your books, there is, the process of taking a photograph for a cookbook is not just, here's some nice food, put it on there. There is a lot to think about in that. If you're using, do you try and simplify the image? Like, just to say, your cookbooks generally, the composition is generally a single plate on a fairly neutral color palette, which both draws attention to the food, but also tends to make it seem more approachable and more possible for someone at home. If they are seeing this complicated, Israeli Levantine spread, then people are going to get quite intimidated by that. But your food always looks approachable. Do you think that you've applied that knowledge in this field?
So the first part of the answer is that I don't think it's related. My dissertation had to do with photography, but it had all sort of lofty ideas about photography, about what is the relationship between a photograph and reality, in philosophical discussions about art. Because when photography arrived on the scene in the early 1800s, people didn't know what to make of it. They couldn't say whether it was a natural object because it was just something that emanated from an object and turned into another object, like a fossil, or whether it was a piece of art, like when you draw, because it looked like something that you could draw. So there was all these discussions, and my dissertation has to do with that. But I didn't really dwell at all about the artistic merits of photographs or anything like that. So I don't think there is connection between this and that. But I have to say that I do really enjoy the styling of my food in the books. And I always, there is no stylist. I always put the food on the plate. And the books are always, visually, our collaboration just between myself and Jonathan Lovekin, who is the photographer. And you were asking a little bit about the aesthetics of the images, and I find something really interesting about food styling and food photography. I don't know if you have it when you do pictures for your books, but
My rule is I never touch the food that goes through the book, because everything that I touch makes it look worse. So I just stand back and then the stylist does like, oh, that looks better than I ever could have made it look.
so I don't believe you, but I really think that sometimes, and this really happens often when we shoot, when you take something that's been on a tray and pour it onto a plate, it looks the best before you touched it. It's just kind of the natural way something falls from one vessel to another makes it look its absolute best. And this is kind of my philosophy, kind of minimal intervention. Of course, stuff happens around. You choose your backgrounds, you choose your plates, you choose certain things. But I try to make the food really look as if it's just been made, and it is just been made. And the other thing, when we cook the food for photography, I always have to make sure that it's exactly as the recipe calls for, so including salt level. So I taste it before we put it. It makes no sense to taste your food before you're going to shoot it, because it's just for the camera. But there's something about that kind of preparing something that is just as real as it can be, that makes it deliver that message in the book. And especially in this book, the latest one, Simple, I wanted to bring this to the fore even more, because it was, for me, this book is about approachability, making things that are approachable to people in more than one way, but still approachable. And that's why it was really important not to make these kind of intimidating shots of food, because you're right, you look at it and you think, I can't do this, I'll move on to the next page. So I really want to make it sure that it looks great, it looks sexy, it looks delicious, but people will feel that they want to make it.
Let's talk a little bit about the development process for putting a book like Simple together. You know, within the recipe writing industry, the accepted process is to Google somebody else's recipe, change 3 ingredients, and then just send it to print. I'm assuming that's what you do, right?
Kind of, yeah.
No, but how does it... Most of your books have been collaborations. Originally with Sami Tamimi. Sweet was done with Helen Go, who's a writer for the Sydney Morning Herald here, also a pastry chef in one of your restaurants.
Yeah.
What's the process behind the development of recipes, the testing of them, even the conceptualization of how is a book going to come together?
Yeah. So I kind of, the way I test recipes, and actually I would call myself now a recipe tester, because that's what I do most of the time. I'm in my test kitchen and I work with a small team of 2 or 3 of us. And essentially I sit there and there's people cooking, and I constantly taste recipes. And the process has really evolved. When I wrote the book Plenty, about 10 years ago, or a bit less than that, I tested all the recipes at home. And and on my own, I used to go do the shopping, do the cooking, washing up, writing down the recipes and submitting them. And it worked quite well at the time, but I felt that I kind of reached the end of how far I could take that system. I really needed more people around me. So I was pushed by one of my partners, Noam, who's always the one who pushes to do things when I think they're too extravagant to do, to get a special space, a test kitchen, where people would come and test recipes. And now I have a team. And the way a recipe comes about is that we have kind of a weekly meeting where we decide what we're going to cook for the next week or so. And we just start cooking and testing. And a recipe could be tested, I don't know, up to about 15 times until we get it really right. Sometimes it's okay after 3 or 4 tests, but most times it's on average 6 or 7 times. And it's a really very, very thorough exercise. We taste, we have discussions, we do. And sometimes people make fun of me because they say, put 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. It's like, what's that all about? And we can't even measure 1/8 of a teaspoon because it's not one of the measuring spoons. But in a sense, what it stands for, I do have 1/8 of a teaspoon measuring spoon, by the way. What it stands for is that I want to bring the reader or the cook as close as possible to where I was standing when I tested this recipe. And I know people are very competent and many cooks have great skills, but I always want to assume that if someone has no skills and they follow the recipe, they'll get as close as possible to where we were at that moment. We were happy with it, finally happy with the recipe. So once that's been done, the recipe is written down, and then it's sent to this very fortunate woman who was featured in The Guardian recently. Her name is Claudine Bolstridge. She lives in Wales, and she's got 3 kids and a husband and parents-in-law that lives across the road. And she lives in rural Wales, and she tries every recipe I've ever published on her family. And she writes a report. And
Is it like Tommy 6 spat out the peas?
a little bit like that. She sometimes writes, Rodri didn't really love this. Rodri is her husband. But the kids absolutely adored it. I mean, just kind of bits of information like that, but also something like, why 180 grams of ricotta when there's 200 grams in a packet? What am I supposed to do with the 20 grams?
Every single person in this audience is like nodding like this right now.
So, and it's very useful to have someone testing a recipe at home on their kind of normal family in a normal kitchen that is not a professional kitchen, and being able to give you an honest opinion of people that are kind of unbiased. And so it's a very lengthy process, but I think it works well for me because I feel very confident that at the end there is something that is pretty foolproof. I mean, people will always not have less success than others in certain recipes, but I have to prove to myself that I've taken it to the limit.
That must be lovely when someone eventually writes to you and goes, "It didn't work for me," and then you go, "Well, it worked for everyone else. It worked 15 times."
Yeah, but the thing is, the science of cooking is really something amazing. I don't know, people are not aware of that, but the size of the pan matters so much. Like, I often write, like, it's at 18 by 24 centimeters roasting pan. And again, some people raise their eyebrows and say, do I really need to know how many centimeters the pan is? And I'll tell you, it's so true, because if you put something there, like if you want to roast something, the amount of liquid that is going to accumulate when you roast make it either dry or into a soup, and it really is those kind of differences. And if you're a confident cook, then you know that this is too small. But if you're not that confident, you just wouldn't know. So it's better just to measure and say what size the pan is.
Brilliant.
Sorry, I probably sound a bit...
No. I want to talk about this a little bit more
OCD,
because in my experience, a lot of chefs and cooks can talk for a very long time about their philosophy and the directions that their food goes. But at their core, when you're at home cooking for your family and you're putting something into a pan, there tends to be something very, very simple behind the way you actually make food taste good. For example, I have a friend whose grandmother, an amazing cook of Chinese food, and I asked her once, what's your secret? And she said, I add half a teaspoon of sugar to everything. And it was just that simple,
A pinch of sugar.
A pinch of sugar to everything. And that was, years later, Tetsuya Wakuda actually said the same thing to me. He was like, to offset the savoriness of soy sauce, which a lot of people are using in Japanese and Chinese cooking, you need to put a little bit of sugar into to balance that taste. And also Tetsuya also mentioned that he thinks that texture is more than 60% of the experience of eating food. We concentrate so much on flavor, but texture is actually a lot more important. Is there something, simple and secret, maybe not even secret, but that you do when you're cooking to make food taste good?
It's a really good question. I never thought about it like that. I mean, I can break it down into different kinds of food, etc. But I can't really say that I've got something like that. I think one thing that I think for me is very important and goes back to vegetable is to try to understand really well what you're cooking with, because certain things just benefit so much from a certain degree of cooking. I mean, we know it so well about meat. Everybody knows how bad, and fish, how bad it is to overcook or undercook a piece of meat. That's, every chef prides himself on getting the right level of cooking. And I think the same really applies to certain vegetables. Of course, you can have more or less, but to understand exactly how far to take a sweet potato is so easy to overcook and make it really horrible and mushy. You just need a tiny bit of resistance because a raw sweet potato is kind of inedible. And so just to get to that level with sweet potato, it's the same level of cooking. But every vegetable is a little bit different like that. You don't eat a raw potato, and you can easily eat a raw cabbage, but it's also nice to cook a cabbage too. So understanding all these things, but it's definitely not a pinch of sugar. I don't have anything like that would just kind of...
But is that sort of... so for example, with Brussels sprouts. Everyone grew up hating Brussels sprouts, but we were all just cooking them wrong. You know, if you roast them or you deep fry them or you just put them down in a pan until they turn a little bit black underneath, it changes the bitterness and the sweetness of that Brussels sprout.
And the Brussels sprout is really, I think the key to cooking Brussels sprouts is actually to cut it or to make something that, because the trouble with the Brussels sprout in the traditional way of cooking is that by the time you cook the middle, the outside is already overcooked and gets that kind of horrible slimy bitterness. So it's about getting it equally cooked throughout in a quick way. So this is why roasting Brussels sprouts or sautéing them or grilling them is so good, because you get a lot of heat very quickly into it, and then you stop cooking before it goes all horrible and bitter.
So you've written 6 cookbooks now. How have you learned through that process? Is Simple as a cookbook very, very different from Ottolenghi as a cookbook?
The writing has really evolved. Like, I think the books that I publish now are better than the ones that I've published before, because I've really learned a little bit about how, like, the process that I described to you is not, I haven't started that way. It's something that has evolved over time. And I'm much more particular about the quality of the recipe testing and what needs to come out of it. But there's also something that I learned, and I think it's got to do with age and with I'm a kind of a late parent, so I became a parent in my mid-40s. So there's something to learn from that experience, in the sense that many of the things that I've published in previous books, or most of the things, my kids wouldn't touch. And I don't say it in a bad way or a good way, it's just a fact, because these are kind of complex flavors, and the textures are probably sometimes too hard for them, etc., etc. And now I look at it slightly more from their perspective, and slightly more from the perspective of different cooks and their expectations. This is why Simple was such an interesting exercise for me, because the way Simple came about is that a few years ago, The Guardian asked me to write a supplement with 20 easy recipes for spring. And I remember when I got the brief, I was just shocked. I said, like, Ottolenghi, I don't do Simple. I was completely like, and this was my reaction, because I said, like, what are they thinking? But then I said, okay, let's take the challenge. And we sat down, myself and Esme and Tara, and we sat down and we thought, like, okay, so let's do something with this. And within like an hour, we had like great ideas. And what all these ideas had in common is the fact that there were things that we do at home, you know, like a pasta or jacket potato, or things that are kind of, but I never thought they were worthy of becoming recipes. And we took them and we kind of Ottolenghified them. We added flavor. We added something like, you know, like rose harissa, or things that are kind of shortcuts for flavor. And all of a sudden, something that seemed almost too simple to be in the book made complete sense, because it had everything that I wanted it to have. The layering of flavor and the interesting look, and the kind of some kind of conflicting textures that make you think. And when it was time to publish the book, I thought to myself, wow, that's a real achievement, because we managed to capture simplicity to a certain degree without losing too much of what I thought was kind of the identifying features of my food.
So your son's Max is, I think, 5 now?
He's 6.
6, and Flynn is 3?
3,
3 or 4?
Flynn is 3.
They're about the same age as my children, and I know that they're very hard to cook for, children at that age. You know, do they have a favorite dish? Is there something that you go to?
Yeah, so my kids are I think they are not very different from other kids at their age. So people would have these expectations that my kids would just have like raw preserved lemon for breakfast or something. But that is just not the case. They are kind of normal children. And so on the one hand, they like broccoli. On the other hand, they would never touch a raw tomato, like not with a barge pole. They just hate them. And they also, I think, something I don't know if you've experienced, but they're very. All these things are completely unpredictable, right? Like they like one thing today, and then they learn the word anymore very early on, and they go, I don't like this anymore. Well, it's something that you've fed them like a million times. And it's like, I don't like prawns anymore. Since when? So they are funny like that. But what they do like is, there's certain things that they do like. I mean, there's the stuff that we all know that they like, the pastas and the rice dishes and all the rest.
What and the chicken nuggets and that kind of thing.
I've yet to try that, but they do like one thing that is my comfort food is their comfort food, and that's majadra rice with lentils and fried onions.
Oh,
which
come
is no, yours wouldn't touch that?
No, I think they would, but I wouldn't describe it like that. It was like, it's rice and onions, eat it.
No, not just like lentils are really like weird. Like they do like lentils. So rice with lentils and lots of fried onion and yogurt on top that eat any day. And people in the audience that have children should go home and try that, and they'll see
I'm going to
right.
give that a go. I'm genuinely.
Yeah.
I've tried everything else. So, in terms of, I guess, the food that you cook and the way that it's been accepted by everyone here, everyone around the world. Is that a challenge for you? Because obviously someone at home in England cooks and eats very differently from someone here in Australia, someone in the US, and all the other places around the world where your books and your style of cooking is very popular. Do you find it hard to, I guess, localize for those audiences, or do you just do what you do and then people take what they want from it?
Yeah, I often think about who is this for, and there are differences, but I actually think that the differences are getting smaller and smaller. I think generally people in urban centers all over the Western world at least, but I think other parts of the world as well, eat more and more similarly. And I guess it's got to do with the availability of produce and books and social media. So you'd be surprised how similar people do eat as far as I can see in different parts of the world that I travel. But I find more interesting the question of, for me, because it's a new thing, is how different people cook rather than people of different nations. It's more about the psychology of the cook. And when we started working on this book, we just got a bunch of people who happened to be around us and asked them, what does simple cooking means to you? And we got really such different answers. And it kind of informed the way the book was structured with the acronym SIMPLE, S-I-M-P-L-E, because some people would say, and for me, that was really eye-opening. Some people would say, I would just like to cook something in 20 minutes. Mm. You know, the amount of time you spend in the kitchen was the criteria, the deciding factor about whether I'm going to go and cook something or not. That's simple cooking for me. And other people say it's absolutely not about the time. It's about the ability to make something ahead of time. So I can make all my preparations an hour or two or a day before I have to throw a dinner party or feed my family. But I wanted to be able to not to worry about it the moment it's time to put the food on the table. Someone else said, I just want to skip the whole shopping business. I don't like going shopping, especially not for Ottolenghi ingredients, which takes you all over town. So I like to cook from my pantry. I like to cook rice and pasta, and I use frozen peas and the bits of parmesan that I've got in my fridge, etc. And these are genuinely different ways of cooking. And since I've asked those questions and got different answers and structured the recipes in the book about that, I really think much more about what different cooks do and how they operate. And it's something that I've never spent a lot of time thinking, and now I do think much more about it. And so when a recipe comes, I often ask the question, who's cooking that recipe? Which I've never asked myself before, who's cooking that recipe. It seems so straightforward to ask the question, but I never asked the question. And it does inform the recipe and what you do with it.
It's incredible. When I saw that in Simple, the way that you'd broken it down with the acronym there, I just thought it was so brilliant because, you know, in Australia we have a magazine called The Women's Weekly, and they used to have their own test kitchen. It's now not in operation anymore, but their rule
Great
was...
recipes, by the way.
Yeah, they were fantastic, but their rule was no more than 11 ingredients would ever make it into a Women's Weekly test kitchen recipe. But there are so many other ways to make food that is simple for that. Sometimes, you know, I get asked for simple ingredients and simple recipes, and there are things that you can make ahead that you can then translate to literally a 10-minute dinner at home. The thing that I've found really useful for this, and I'm not sure if you agree, is social media these days. It used to be, when I released my first book, which was a few years after you released yours, the feedback that I got from going to events like this and talking to people and book signings, someone saying, I like this, I didn't like that, or I couldn't find this ingredient anywhere, was useful. And now with social media, you can get that feedback all the time. How do you find the feedback? Is it good?
Feedback.
I say that with trepidation because we all know what the internet's like, right?
No, I actually thrive on the feedback in a sense because before social media, and I think when I published my first book, it was just before you get that kind of deluge of feedback that we have now, almost too much of it. I never quite knew what people were doing with the recipes, and we put something out there that you've spent a long time putting together, and putting all your love and energy into something that you like so much and appreciate. Not to get the feedback is actually, I prefer over feedback than no feedback, and I think now when I look at people, I can literally immediately know what's popular and what's not, what dish in the book is a hit, and I think that's great because it really informs the way I would do the next recipe book, because I know that in simple, the slow-cooked chicken with a corn crust is like the most popular dish, so I'm going to do more of those. It's like because in a sense it's not really worth it making recipes that people don't cook. I want the ones that they cook. So that I find very useful. What I don't like, just on that, is when people say to me, I've cooked that recipe of yours, but I've changed this and that, and it didn't work. Why?
You are my idol now. This is the bane of my existence, that I changed everything in your recipe. It didn't work out the way I intended.
Can you analyze that for me?
But when you were writing Simple, was that the corn-crusted slow-cooked chicken, was that the recipe that you thought was going to be the most popular, or did you think there was something else?
No, when you put a book out, I normally don't really know what is going to be the most popular dish. I know now that in Plenty More, there's a cauliflower cake that everybody seems to make, and I had no idea that I thought it was just a averagely good recipe, but everybody makes that cauliflower cake, and I think for all sorts of reasons, because it's called a cake, it sounds good, and also because it's full of vegetables, so it's like you win from no matter how you look at it. But I never know exactly what's. In Plenty, one of the most popular dishes is the black pepper tofu. Which, it's a traditional Chinese dish, and Helen Go gave me the recipe for that. And it had like 5 tablespoons of ground pepper, and I thought, like, what on earth is that? And I cooked it. It was really good, but I never thought that would be one of the most popular dishes in the book, and it ended up being. So, there you go.
Now that, I guess, the Ottolenghi empire as such has become relatively influential, extremely influential, I would have to say. Do you feel additional pressure on, I guess, back in the old days, you used to be able to throw anything up on the deli menu or put it into an article in The Guardian, and maybe some people might like it and some people might not. But do you think that there's more that you need to pay attention to now in terms of things like sustainability, in terms of,
Yeah, much more pressure like that. I think also because there's more of those conversations are being held in the public. So for instance, with fish, I actually end up using, I publish very few fish recipes because, especially in the UK, the amount of sustainable, affordable fish is really minimal. And in our restaurants, we do the same. So I'm very aware of that conversation. I'm trying to think much more about all these. It's never been my first consideration, because for me it's all about the flavor. But the next consideration would be all those issues, because I don't operate in a vacuum, and people are very, very vocal. One of the things that is really strong, not so much here, but or in the UK, but in America, because I was on an American book tour in October, is the question of who owns the food, like who is it? Cultural appropriation.
The cultural appropriation question.
And it's a really, really big question in America at the moment. And every person that cooks has to deal with the question of cultural appropriation. And it's massive. It's massive. And I almost find myself, I had to deal with that a long time ago with Jerusalem, because it deals with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and who owns recipes and who started them. And in that conflict, it's a serious question, because people's sense of self depends on food when they've got very little else. But I find this really, really difficult, because I don't even know how to answer these questions in the American context. Is it okay for a white person to cook Mexican food? How can I answer this question? You know, it's really difficult.
I mean, I find that a little bit perverse, to be honest, because I think that food is one of the great unifiers. Before you speak someone's language, before you understand their history, before you walk a mile in their shoes, you can eat the same thing that person eats, and get some insight into the way their life works, the way their culture works. And so I don't really believe in cultural appropriation in foods, because I think it is such a wonderful window into other aspects of the multicultural societies that we live in.
I'm completely with you on that. I mean, the funniest thing happened to me a few years ago when I published, my husband is Irish, and I published a recipe for my version on an Irish stew. And I even put the Irish in quotation marks just to make sure that people don't take me so literally. And my Irish stew had some, orange zest and a little bit of parsley and this and that. And the amount of negative feedback I got underneath my column, normally I don't read those things, but I actually do, but only when everybody falls asleep. And I thought, that is not an Irish stew, and an Irish stew is strictly mutton, potatoes, and carrots, and this and that. So, who would want to eat that, right? and it's so many kind of really angry people protecting the poor old Irish stew. And I thought, and then when I looked at those people that were kind of fighting for the Irish stew, they were all English. They were not even Irish. And it just goes to show that it just can go so far, and everybody's trying to defend the oppressed. But actually, who is oppressed? Just an Irish stew.
I should tell you that here in Australia, we have a version of an Irish stew that is the shape of a Chinese spring roll filled with barley and lamb and potato and peas, I think. It's called a Chico roll.
Sounds...
And I suggest that if anyone offers you one, run as far as you can away from that particular thing.
I thought it sounded really good.
But food is obviously a very powerful force. It can change the way people think, it can change the way people live, it can change their health. But is there a limit to what it can do? Obviously you've collaborated for a long time as an Israeli Jew with a Palestinian Arab, Sami Tamimi. Australia, the UK, America, very multicultural countries in terms of the way the population is made up, also in terms of the way that the population eats. Most of the people here in this room, most of the people around Australia will eat Vietnamese food, Chinese food, Italian food, Greek food, English food, American food, whatever. But yet we still have big problems with race relations in all of the countries that I've just mentioned. Why has our love of food in a cultural context not really translated as well to an interpersonal understanding?
This is it's a really serious question. I think it's tragic, really, that we are so good at adapting ourselves into different cuisines and enjoying and being, super international and not being able to apply the same level of tolerance that we do to other people, to the actual people that cook them. And I find that, because I come from Israel and I see that every day. I mean, and I use the word tragic because it is tragic. There's no other description. I mean, Palestinians and Jews in Israel and Palestine eat the same food. And that is a language, right? They really eat the same food. They enjoy the same kind of level of spicing and the same kind of way of eating, the informality, the chickpeas and the tahini and the olive oil and the olives. And it's insane that they can actually share that kind of intimacy around food, and they can't have that same conversation with each other. And I don't know if it says something about the human condition or it's something about this just point in history, but it just doesn't seem to be doing enough. I mean, but there is, I mean, that's a very negative way of looking at it. I mean, there is also positive sides to that, and there is a lot of dialogue that happens around food. And one of the things that I think is the most incredible thing that happened around food with social media is that there is a group of people all over the world that really speak the same language, the language of food. And you know, you mentioned Brussels sprouts, and all of a sudden, like 2 years ago, Brussels sprouts were like on every restaurant table in every country on the planet. You know, I think I went to Moscow or somewhere, and they had like roasted Brussels sprouts, and I was like, wow. And that is really special. If we could take that and make it something that people would actually do in their real lives, you know, in their way they interact with each other, that would be an incredible achievement.
I think there is hope for us yet. You know, the multicultural nature of the food that we eat is very young, as is the multicultural nature of the societies we live in.
That is true.
If you look at, you know, what do they call it, the Colombian transfer, where chilies and tomatoes and corn and all those various other things went from Central America around the world. That was only 400 odd, 500 odd years ago, maybe earlier. Don't fact check me on any of this, please. But we're almost running out of time here. There are a few stations that I have up. One here, two up on the top tier there, and then one around here. If you do have any questions for Yotam, we'll be doing about 20 minutes odd of questions. So if you could start making your way, we can't take too many, obviously, but if you could make your way towards those microphones, so when we come to the questions that you'll be ready to ask, please feel free to do that now. I might start with a question from my friend Laura, who's in the audience tonight, who did ask me the very nuts and bolts question of, assuming you were on a desert island, I know, what 3 ingredients do you think would be important to you that you would like to have? That you can assume that coconuts are already on the island.
Coconut. Coconut, I love coconuts. It's one of the least useful ingredients in my cooking, but I'll definitely take it. And actually, there's fish fingers in this book that have fresh coconut on them that are very delicious, and I recommend trying them. Just on the subject of coconut, but I think the top ingredient, I think anyone who's in this room would be able to answer. It's on my shirt. That's, by the way, this is the John Lemon T-shirt, and I found it on a website, and it was so appropriate because of the book. But so I brought it with me. So lemon would have to be there, and I have to come some kind of starch. I want to say flour, because then you can just do stuff in breads and things like that. Lemons and what else? Olive oil.
Wow.
I can do quite a lot with those things. But the coconut and the animals that I might hunt. Can you see me doing that?
I do love seeing the answer to this question because some people, you know, when they're given 3 ingredients to choose from, they choose their 3 favorite ingredients, the things they like to eat the most. You know, oh, bring me a chorizo and something. But then you've got someone like Yotam who is looking for the most versatile ingredients possible, as if he's actually on the island. You know, he's thinking, how long do I have to live on this island for? And
are you saying I was taking you too literally, right?
No, it just gives us an insight.
You should have asked me about my death row meal.
Oh yeah, let's go for that one.
That's what you wanted.
I didn't ask for that. I actually.
But we need to leave someone
5
for
people being invited to a dinner party, alive or dead, and death row meal are 2 things that I'm kind of sick of being asked myself.
Yeah.
So
well, exactly. So let's not ask those questions.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thank you all so much for coming along tonight, but most of all, especially to the busiest man in the world for being so generous with your time.
Thank you.
Yotam Ottolenghi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was brilliant.